Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the podcast for exceptional people, where we hope to get into conversations in education, all things past, present, and future. Joining our conversation today is Alexis Boyden, who's going to be presenting and speaking at the CEC conference coming up in Baltimore. Alexis, one of the things that really fascinates me and encouraged me to invite you on is your work around inclusive classrooms and inclusive communities, in particular bringing parents and administrators like myself on board. So thank you for joining our conversation today.
Thank you for having me. Well, I'm excited to be presenting in a couple of weeks at the CEC. Two couple of collaborative presentations that I'm a part of. One around family engagement, and the other around collaborative practices. So I hope to be bringing some tools for teachers and administrators that they can take away with them after the conference.
And that's awesome. So our first question today is, what was the original spark in terms of your interest in bringing a real focused attention to inclusive classrooms?
Okay, I'd say like I'm both focused on inclusion and advocacy, and I've always been sort of a justice-oriented person, as many of us are in our field. And my K-12 experience was not the best. I always felt unseen. I struggled academically. I was a terrible test taker. Like I got a 14 on the ACT, like a bad test taker. And while I had a lot of ideas, like I still do, I struggled with writing and math. And I really just felt like no one ever saw me in my schooling experience. So, and I had a teacher in fifth grade, Mr. Warden. I kid you not, that was his name. And he used to put a student in the corner irregularly, sometimes in the closet, and sometimes with a literal dunce cap on. He really humiliated and ostracized Carl, and his peers really stayed away from him. He sat across the classroom from me, so I didn't have any opportunity to really exchange with him, communicate with him in class, but he really was ostracized from his peers at school because of that experience. And, I never really understood why, because I didn't sit near him enough to know why Mr. Warden was yelling. And plus, I was focused on my own trauma of like crying every day during math class because he wouldn't help anybody with anything. He'd just sit at his desk. But he might probably retrospectively was just a kid who couldn't sit in his seat, keep his mouth quiet, probably had ADHD. But, this is the 70s. So there was no recognition of this, right? So I feel like these experiences like this example kind of shaped me. And as I got older, I wanted to be that person that made other kids feel seen. And I've always been about inclusion and advocacy when I was in schools, working in schools. I always felt like I was an advocate first and always focused on inclusion and bringing inclusive education for all learners.
It's funny to hear you say that. It's funny how many of us informally started because we wanted to advocate for ourselves, right? We wanted to advocate for our past selves as students, and that's kind of what drew us into this. And that's what I hear is the original spark there, and that's really cool. That makes your work personal then in that way.
Mm-hmm.
So as you've been working on these things, what is something that's been confirmed for you, and what is something that you've learned new along the way?
Well, I've spent, like 15 years working in schools before transitioning into consulting. So working in large urban schools like Chicago, a large suburban school in like Ann Arbor Public, working in alternative education, you see different aspects of, teaching and learning when you work in different varieties. So I think that and also having been an administrator, having been an assistant principal as well myself in a smaller, like poor, very divided community, I would say. I even worked in a private school. So having like some of this broad spectrum of experiences, I think really informs is something I bring to the table that not many educators have had that opportunity because I've moved around a lot. So that sort of brought these experiences to me as well. And but now working the last 6 years or so with families as an advocate for children, that's really opened my eyes around the family experience. While I always felt like an advocate for my students, when you when you walk alongside families, you kind of see things through a different lens. So my clients come from all walks of life, just like they did when I was working in schools. But they are struggling with the same issues, which is what I find kind of fascinating. It doesn't matter what color their skin is, what socioeconomic status they're from. None of that matters. They're having the same issues with the schools, or their perception of things are similar, right? Let's say. So when you're on the school side of the table, there's often this frustration with families, right? This kind of us versus them mentality, which is, of course, counterproductive, right? And families really, I feel through my experiences, really hold the key to our future in the educational system. They've become voiceless, right? Just as voiceless as their students. I also know how ignorant our communities are around how schools work, right? And I wonder sometimes how, you know, how that has impacted the educational system, the lack of knowledge families have around what the school day really feels like. They only have their own K-12 experience, which is, of course, laden with their own lived experiences, which sometimes isn't positive, right? As even, I shared my not so positive story. That's just one of many. And I'm sure we all have, some negative experiences. And education is just not very transparent. We're really like, we shut the door. We don't want to let anybody in. We don't want anybody to see what's going on for fear of lawsuits or whatever. But what I find with the families I work with is they don't want to have this tumultuous relationship school. They really want to be more collaborative with the school, but nobody's being transparent with them. Nobody's communicating the whole story to them. They don't understand what's going on in the building. And this really, I feel like it needs to change. So I think when, that's the biggest thing I've learned is sitting on the other side of the table is families really bring a lot of value to the, can bring a lot more value to the system. And if we don't bring them in, we're losing public education. We're seeing it happen right before our eyes.
We are. Yes, we see it happen, and we see it deepen every year, or at least I do, and I think you share that experience. So did you find that sort of apprehension from the school side, the school players, the administrators, and the leaders of the IEP teams and things like that? Was there apprehension to bring families in? Did you find that consistent in all of the environments you worked in?
Yes, I would say, and I would say that Chicago, and when I was there, which of course, that was the start of my career, so that was over 20 years ago, was probably the best at it. We had things like requirements that we had to make so many phone calls home every week. So if we didn't have, we had to find reasons to call home. And so they would be positive, right? Which is kind of today, like what we talk about, like you should have 3 positives before you have a negative, right? Like all of that stuff. We were kind of doing that all back then in hopes of like engaging and getting families to be more involved in their child's education. So, and of course we had language barriers and things like that. And attendance issues, galore in that environment. So I think, yes, from every experience I've had, there's always been this dichotomy, this us versus them, like families don't care, they don't show up, they're not engaged, this like assumption that because they couldn't make it to a meeting or they didn't come to parent-teacher conferences that they don't care. And it's just not true. It's just not true.
Right, but that seems to be the easiest and most
Mm-hmm.
common assumption anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So
Just like
I'm
kids, like they don't show up to school. If they show up to school every day, even if they're not performing well, they got there for a reason,
That's
right?
right. They're
They
there for a
showed up.
reason, and they showed up.
Mm-hmm.
So clearly, I'm not a skeptic, right? I mean, attendance is one of the things that I lose sleep over right now. Just how do we engage our families? So I am not a skeptic, but if you were faced with a panel full of skeptics, what's the first point that you're going to make, or the first argument that you're going to make to bring them on board for the work that you're doing?
It's such a tough question when so I don't think of myself as someone who's like good at persuading people onto my side, but I think I would kind of appeal to their sense of humanity, if you will. If I'm talking to practicing educators, how stressed and unhappy I see them today in schools. Like whether I'm sitting with the family across the table, I can see it because I sat on their side of the table. So I can see how much lower morale is today than it even was, when I was there. And also walking alongside educators through inclusion coaching and things like that, I can see how challenging it is today for educators. So I think things have to change for everybody, for the kids, for our families, and for our teachers. So we have to work together as a community to reshape the system, right, into one that works for us all, right, and that one that is transparent and is about elevating our children, right? School shouldn't be a place where kids just simply survive. It's like a rite of passage, right? We should be thriving in our school environments and reaching our fullest potentials, right? And I think we can all agree on that, right? It's just, how do we get there? How can we shape that future together? We have this great opportunity right now. I think even since the pandemic hit, we've had this one, we have a missed opportunity there actually now, where we could have, all the problems that came out in the pandemic were already there, right? I think it's pretty common knowledge now. They were just exasperated. It was so frustrating to me watching schools do so many ridiculous things with these funds that weren't sustainable. So we have this opportunity again to fix what's broken and recreate, but we can't do it. Like, I don't have an ideal, I don't know what that outcome looks like. It has to be done together. It has to be collaborative, and it has to be one where we're all open to outcome, right? So everybody has a stake in it.
I like that, to the skeptic of, okay, if it's not the students, then the parents. If it's not the parents, then the teachers. If it's not the teachers, then the support staff. Pick somebody, because we're all going to benefit from this work. So
Mhm.
pick the people that you do care about and fight for them, and guess what? We'll all benefit as a side effect. And I like what you said there about COVID too. Is the two frustrating things about COVID, I think, first on a personal level, was like hearing the national conversation expose the problems in education, where people like you and I have been in it for 2 decades were like, yeah, we've been telling you guys about that for 20 years. Like, we've been trying to fix that for 20 years. Like, thank you. Come on board now.
Mhm.
And then the other parts was watching these resources just pour in, and people truly doing the best that they could. Right? We didn't know, and we're applying hindsight to all of this stuff now. But watching these resources, and a few times just being like, oh, are we really going to do that with that amount of money or that amount of manpower? Because that's
Mhm.
not going to do anything.
Right. Right. We had this opportunity to pour money into creating sustainable systems and practices, and instead we bought people that now have to be fired. We bought police security systems that we know don't really reduce crime in schools. So it was very, I was frustrated at the time too, watching. I'm like, why? In my own community where people were putting money, it just didn't make sense to me.
But
Training would make more sense, creating systems, reviewing curriculum, integrating SEL, all of these sorts of things we should have been doing long ago, you know.
I think I keep thinking about systems and training, right? And again, not to beat anybody for what we did. I made all kinds of bad choices during, school leadership during those COVID years. But yeah, what a lesson that we can learn now of, okay, well, we did these things that were unsustainable and
Mhm,
did not leave an impact behind.
mhm,
So next time, if we're confronted with this, let's invest in those things instead.
mhm.
And I think that
Yeah, no
equitable,
band-aids, no band-aids.
no
That's,
mandates.
yeah.
I think that equitable practices, and I think that inclusivity is where it starts, right? Because the central notion of all of it is we are human beings,
Mhm,
and we are going to show up sometimes, and sometimes we're not going to show up. But either way, we're human beings, um,
mhm.
and our perspective matters.
Yeah, I think it's important. What the biggest thing we missed was involving families in the process, involving the community in the process, because in students, right? Because we're so afraid. I love how Dr. Shade Harris, I don't know if you're familiar with her, but she talks a lot about family engagement and sharing power. I love the way she puts that true engagement is around sharing power with families. And we're so afraid of that in education for some reason, that it's going to expose something. Well, it's all exposed, you know, it's all out there. So there's nothing to fear.
Yeah, and shouldn't it be, right? I mean, this is the education system that we have is not for the present moment. It is for all of the future moments that we don't know about yet. So,
Mm-hmm.
your work is awesome. The advocacy that you're doing. Super excited to meet you when we get to Baltimore, which is coming up real soon. What,
I
like
know.
I think we leave a week from Wednesday. We head up there.
Mhm.
So yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing you, Alexis. Um, what's one thing that you want your audience to walk away from in Baltimore after they come see you?
Well, I have two focuses, like I said, family engagement and inclusion. So I hope that we walk away with a better understanding of how families feel in the IEP process and just in special education and in our schools in general. And that we can break down some of the walls that exist between families and educators, and then how to collaborate with one another to solve the problems in the classroom, to meet the needs of students, to really reach and teach all learners in the classrooms, in our classrooms. So that's
Awesome.
my
I cannot wait to be a member of your sessions and to see you there. Thank you so much, Alexis, and we will see you in Baltimore.
thank you. Well, nice to meet you.
You too.